Good morning and welcome to the public meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Development. My name is Jane Wayallen Armstrong and I am the MLA for Montpellier-Klitschou Region and Chair of the Standing Committee on Social Development. I will now ask the members in the room and online to introduce themselves for the record.
Hi, Julian Morse, MLA for Frame Lake.
George Nerzu, MLA for the Mackenzie Delta.
Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Kieran Testart, member for Range Lake.
Kate Reed, MLA for Great Slave.
Okay. Thank you, members. Today we will receive a briefing on housing as a human right from Tony Brechette, Salvation Army. This briefing is part of a committee study on how NWT legislation and policies can incorporate housing as a human right. Please note, this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly's social media channel. I would like to remind all members and witnesses to direct all questions and comments to myself as chair and to wait to be recognized before speaking to help us have a smooth meeting. So now I will pass it on to Mr. Brechette. Please proceed with your presentation.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity, Madam Chairperson and committee members. My presentation is low-tech compared to the one you had earlier this week. I'll strictly read from my notes here. I'm not sure how familiar you are with my role in the homelessness continuum. Suffice it to say that here in the Northwest Territories, we, the Salvation Army, are usually tasked with housing the very hardest individuals to house, the vulnerable and the homeless population. Adequate housing is defined under international law as the right for every woman, man, youth, and child to gain and sustain a safe and secure home and community in which to live in peace and dignity. This right is so much more than simply 4 walls and a roof over your head. In 2019, Parliament passed the National Housing Strategy Act. The Act recognizes housing as a human right and commits organizations and governments to reform housing laws, policies, and programs from a human rights perspective and to involve communities in a meaningful way. And I did witness this in a community engagement several months ago with MLA Morgan. She had invited the Premier along to the constituency meeting, and almost from the start it gravitated towards the whole homelessness and everything that comes with that issue. The National Housing Strategy Act calls for the progressive realization of the right to housing. This means Canada must set specific timelines and goals in its housing strategy to make tangible progress toward the right for housing. It also means Canada must prioritize the most vulnerable groups and those in greatest need of housing while it works towards housing as a human right for all. And not being from a legal background, I kind of take this to mean that while it's not government's responsibility to put every resident in Canada in a house, it is every level of government's responsibility to ensure that they're doing all they can to encourage reform of housing laws, policies, programs from a human rights perspective, and to involve communities, including residents of our cities, NGOs, and most importantly, representation from the population who are most affected by the homelessness crisis. Brings me to what I want to say today, and based on what I just read to you, housing rights, which I said amount to much more than a roof over a person's head, which is what we at best in the NGOs are trying to do daily, and we admit that we often fail. The definition of adequate housing means that it meets all social, economic, environmental, cultural, and basic needs of each distinct and often different individual. And as we are all supposed to be considered as equal in the eyes of the government as citizens of this country, it needs to be recognized that this definition of adequate housing can mean something different from one person to the next, depending on their circumstances. A person who has a physical disability will have different needs than a person who's physically capable of looking after all their own needs. Just because a person may need ramps, accessible appliances, and living spaces, it should never mean that they move further down a list for housing. But because of the supply is not there, that is almost often the case here. Then there are those who are emotionally and mentally unwell. What should housing look like for them? A traditional 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house is likely not the appropriate answer here. Right now, because for most part, nobody has been able to, and in some cases willing to seriously take on the fight for the vulnerable, which means they end up in the shelter system or worse. And sometimes, but not often enough, if we're able to graduate them from a shelter user into our mental health or our addictions floors, which is still temporary, and I say woefully understaffed to deal with the complexities that they come with, the supports for successes are still not available to them. If we find somebody's doing very well under our care in any of our programs, and we can sometimes move them right directly into our supportive housing, but that too is only supposed to be temporary, and the sad reality is when the maximum stay of 3 years is reached in the supportive housing, we have no choice but to release them from the program and their living arrangements, and often right back into the shelter system, simply because in a lot of cases there are no rentals available, or landlords don't want to rent to what I call our population. The question that we are often asked concerning our own supportive housing units is around the occupancy time limits. Why do we force people out after 3 years of stable living? Simple answer is these folks are program participants, they're not tenants. Our goal from the moment we move you into our transitional housing is to help you find suitable permanent housing in the community. Unfortunately, under law, once someone is defined as a tenant, which legally they can be after that 3-year mark of consistent residency, it becomes difficult to move them out under the Landlord Tenancy Act. Northwest Territories, and these extended residencies would go against the funding model that we currently have with the NWT for this program. Northwest Territories MLAs have made it very clear in stating that housing should be a fundamental right in the territory, and that sentiment is shared by national and international governments around the world in making this a part of the territory's laws. It was brought forward in a motion earlier this year to make housing a fundamental human right in the Northwest Territories, and all regular MLAs voted in favor. It was said that by acknowledging housing as a human right, it means that the territory acknowledges housing is essential to a person's dignity and their well-being. And thankfully, our current government has made housing one of its 4 priorities over the next 4 years. But by also making it a human right, it sends the message it's even more than just a priority. MLA Cheryl Yakale, and I do apologize if I mispronounced the name, said the motion pushes the territory to evaluate housing programs and to reduce homelessness and increase affordability. And she finishes this statement with, "It's been said in this House many times, the Northwest Territory is in a housing crisis." Allow me to echo the MLA's words in saying, I've been doing this a long time across the country for the Salvation Army, and I can also say without hesitation, yes, we're in a housing crisis. And dare I say that crisis may even be disproportionately higher in the territories compared to many parts of Canada. I have recently met several individuals who are looking to come and move to Yellowknife, mostly for higher paying jobs, better careers, but there's simply little or no housing. Those are not the people I want to bring to you today. Those folks have decisions they can make, and often they can move from there. Many of our permanent Northwest Territories residents do not have that luxury. I want to talk about the rights and the human rights of the person who lives in my shelter, the person who's surfing couches for years on end, and even worse, the growing population of those sleeping rough outside. I recently spoke to a young man in his early 20s who looked very much out of place as he was lining up at our shelter at 6:30 at night. I asked him, "How did you end up here?" He said, "Mom couldn't take me sleeping on the couch in her 1-bedroom apartment anymore and told me I had to go." So to finally get to the answer to the questions, what does a right to housing mean here in the Northwest Territories? We would all agree that homeless shelters are not housing, and they're certainly not the answer to housing. But I think we could all agree that's not going to disappear anytime soon. So we collectively need to at least temporarily include the shelter population as a piece of a much larger housing puzzle, and stop just using shelters simply as a place to dump those who are down and out. What if we looked at the vulnerable population and started with those who are chronically homeless? This is where the initial conversations and actions can happen around human rights and housing for those individuals. The current shelter model here in the Northwest Territories is awful. And anyone who knows me knows that I mean no disrespect to anybody, and I'm not here to lay blame on any one entity. We all have a stake in this. It's just a sad fact and a reality of where we are today. Here's our current situation at the Salvation Army. As a man who is homeless for one or more of many reasons, you come into my shelter at 7 o'clock at night. We're going to give you a hot meal. We're going to get you showered, get you to wash your clothes, then you're going to bed. At 7 o'clock in the morning, you're up and you're out the door. Our staff are gone at 7. And does that sound like any definition of housing? Does that sound like any definition of dignity, actually? Where does that fall to when we're thinking about people's human rights? There's practically no chance for any meaningful conversation or counseling to determine if an individual can survive outside shelter life and move into something more stable in those few short hours we have them, especially since the individual is coming to us at the end of a hard day, emotionally and or physically are not willing and often not able to hold meaningful conversations. And we basically kick them out as soon as they open their eyes in the morning. If our shelter was open 24/7, as it is in all other 53 shelters that we offer across this country through the Salvation Army, then shelter users could have the opportunity during the day to meet with counselors, whether that's to talk about housing, mental health, addictions, so much more. That is the dignity piece and possibly even the human rights piece that we talk about. Allowing grown men and women the chance to share or vent, and it will give our staff the opportunity to do some initial assessments to help determine what next steps, including appropriate housing, could look like for each individual. Allow me to speak just for a moment on our addictions and mental health floors. And I do that simply because the reality is individuals are often put into these programs by their caseworkers because they have nowhere else to live, as much or more as they would for their mental health and addictions issues. These programs, while they're shorter by design, are not funded adequately and woefully understaffed by people who are not as well trained as we would want and need them to be. And these programs are not a home, but they are treated as one. They should be an early step for individuals on the way to becoming a good character for some form of housing. Because of the funding model, our staff are only partially trained and qualified and can only take these individuals so far in their journey. And it's often not enough to appease any of our landlords out there to give them that chance to move out on their own if we put in the right supports. The system is not set up in any form for success for this population. And let's think about it. These are the same individuals most at risk of getting caught up in our criminal justice system without the appropriate support. Where do they end up? They go to jail, then they're released back to homelessness, and it's a vicious circle, goes around and around. Then there's our Bailey House, which is a 32-bed supportive housing facility. And let me be clear, I've learned rather quickly, this is a vital and, dare I say, a life-saving program for some people in Yellowknife. And almost every one of the 32 participants sitting in there right now would be homeless without that program. If there was a stock of adequate, available, affordable housing for these individuals, once we get them stabilized, most would only stay with us for a month up to several months, not years, opening beds for others. This could mean folks from the shelter, mental health, addictions, the community, could then move into these units if they were appropriately supported along the way. Right now, instead of our ideal turnover rate of 150 individuals in this supportive housing, we're down to about 10 to 15 people a year who move out, and most are asked to move out. So what does a right to housing mean for law and policies in the Northwest Territories? It means that we, the city, the NWT, the federal government, the NGOs, all of us involved in this work, we need to all get on the same page of what housing looks like for vulnerable populations, because right now we're not. And again, that will differ from person to person. There could be transitional processes, moving individuals along the homelessness and the housing continuum that we could follow at our facility and other facilities. If there was appropriate funding, giving us appropriate staffing to ensure that every person who walks through the doors is given a fighting chance for appropriate housing based on the individual needs. That could mean moving from emergency shelter to mental health or addictions or straight into a supportive housing. Right now, people are not being appropriately assessed for suitable housing. But even that can't happen because the system is not equipped to deal with those individuals at the mental and emotional stage they are when we receive them. Then if we do manage to find these jewels in the crown through the stages of recovery that seem to have everything going, everything stops for this population. Now they're at the end of their supportive housing stay and the cycle starts all over again. I know I seem to be oversimplifying this, but somebody, all levels of government, and obviously the community partners, need to facilitate building more affordable housing, especially for this population. Somehow government and big business need to partner to make this work. There's a lot of new condominiums being built here, renting for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month and more. They're much needed here in Yellowknife, but it does zero to very little to help those who are very vulnerable and financially struggling. NGOs who are already trying their best to care for this population need to have more qualified staff to work with these individuals, giving them a fighting chance of getting back into the community in a meaningful way. I've taken a different approach to the question of housing as a human right, but I'm doing it from my area of expertise, and that is looking after a population who would simply, for a lot of people, they would like to just see them disappear. And I think, again, we can agree we're far from that scenario. I think if we were to ask every single individual experiencing homelessness, such as those in the encampment on 51st, or those in danger of becoming homeless, is this where they would want to be in life if given a chance? Not one person. Not one would say yes. Everyone just wants, needs, and deserves a dignified place to rest their head at night and call it home. And I know it sounds like I'm talking about this all being about money. And while every level of government will almost always say we don't have additional money, aren't we already spending a ton of money on some systems that are far from dignified? They often don't work in the best interest of the users, and certainly in some instances do not offer much of anything in the way of human rights. I want to read a final statement from the National Right to Housing Network. The right to housing under international human rights law does not mean that the government must provide everybody with housing. It recognizes that all people have the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity, and that governments must implement reasonable policies and programs which will ensure that everyone has access to adequate housing by one means or another as soon as this can be achieved within our available resources. The National Housing Strategy Act affirms that this commitment must guide housing policy and programs, prioritizing those in the greatest needs. In closing, I asked my frontline managers the question that you folks asked me here about what housing as a basic human right looks like. I got a lot of the same answers to what I've discussed here, but one stuck out to me. It was from our mental health manager. She says, to answer this question from the perspective of the clientele I work with, housing is one of the biggest challenges and acts as a barrier to integrate them back into the society. Some of our clients have overcome the mental health challenges and are stable enough to start the independent journey, and they're placed on long waiting lists for housing that often take many years. Yellowknife does not have the capacity to meet the growing housing demands. For instance, when a client has completed their program here, or no longer need to be here and they're discharged from the program, they have no place to go. Therefore, it leads to increased homelessness, accessing shelters, and it has a direct negative impact on their mental health. In my opinion, if somebody is stable enough to start their independent journey of life in the community, then having housing should be a basic right. Honorable Chairperson, I do thank you for this opportunity to share, and I certainly do welcome any questions that anyone would have.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I will now ask the member if they have any questions. Ms. Morgan?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Brescia, for taking the time and preparing such a thoughtful presentation, both explaining to us about your specific work, but also the national context and the right to housing. I appreciate that. You mentioned that you see landlords refusing to rent to people who use the shelter system. It seems, it seems you're talking even about people who have, been stable for a period of time and are, quote unquote, graduating from your programs. Do you see, like, are there official policies that landlords can show, or is it an informal thing? Are there, ban lists? Can you just explain more about how that works and from what you were seeing?
Okay, yes, Mr. Brusher.
Sure, there are official ban lists. I think there should also be ways for those ban lists to be readjusted from time to time based on where a person is in their lives. But quite often, our population, they're all flagged as the same. I had problems with somebody from that population before, so I'm not taking anybody new. It's we're trying more and more that our support teams that work with them when they're in-house follow them through to possible housing, and we work with them while they're in the community. It's a struggle when housing is at such a shortage, and if we're looking for a one-bedroom space for one of our people and 30 other people are looking for it, even though it's not said out loud, our folks get dropped to the bottom. And we're trying very hard to change that perception. And across the country, in many areas, in my last place I ran, we had a fund set up. So we would sign up with the landlord stating that if this person causes damages, the Salvation Army will pay for it. So maybe we need to figure out a way to do that here as a starting point. But certainly, I don't think there's a written policy by most landlords, but we know, and our caseworkers know from working with them all the time, from the moment you walk in the room, this is not going anywhere when you want to have that conversation.
Ms. Morgan, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And so can you just clarify, has the Salvation Army in Yellowknife tried offering landlords sort of this security deposit or guarantee, or is that something you've done in other places that you're thinking of doing here? Just to clarify that one. Thank you.
Mr. Brusher?
We have not tried it here. In the other places that we've done this, we've had funding for it, so it's not the Salvation Army's money. In all honesty, we can't afford to do it ourselves. But in some of the contracts that we would negotiate through different levels of government, would have it built in. In one case, we had a community member who said that he understands that he came from that population many years ago, and he funds the repairs to these apartments for us. He's a contractor by trade. So there's many different ways it can happen. We have not been able to do it here so far because simply it's economics for us. We don't have the funding internally to do it. It's certainly a conversation that we do want to start having as we go forward. I think our biggest focus right now are getting those off the street before the winter hits.
Mr. Tister, do you have
Thank you, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your presentation as well. I know we've spoken about this before, and I think you bring a lot of insight to the table and have really raised the urgency of the challenges the shelter system is facing. To my colleague's comment about line of questioning about the providing deposits to help people get into housing. How is that substantially different from public housing programs? Because many of our public housing units are actually rented from landlords, from private landlords, or from corporate landlords. So is there a large distinction between the two? Thank you.
Mr. Brusher?
There is. So we wouldn't necessarily be looking to give the landlords the financial piece up front. We would be giving them the written guarantee that the Salvation Army, through the funding that we get, would ensure that if there are damages while this person is there, that we would cover all that. So there still would be the whole piece of your first month's rent, and a lot of them would require damage deposit. That would not change. This would be in addition to all that, because the damage deposit usually won't cover the damages if somebody really wants to make a mess.
Mr. Tister, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you. Yes, a different topic. So 24-hour shelters You say like that's the model for the Salian across the country. Why isn't it practical here or practicable here? Is it a funding issue? Is it a regulatory issue? Because if this is the best practice, why can't we do it in Yellowknife? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Bishop?
That's a question I've been asking for my 14 months up here. In all honesty, and again, we'll go back to the point, shelters are not the long-term answer here. You know, my goal for the Salvation Army is to do my piece to shut down all 53 shelters because we don't need them in the country. But waking guys up in our case at 7 in the morning and you're out the door to your own devices is quite different than in all of our other shelters. At 7 in the morning, you're getting up. For the next hour or so, we're serving breakfast. And then there's a TV out in the common area, but also in that common area, strategically placed are housing workers, mental health and addictions workers. They gravitate towards them as they get to know them more. And we're finding that if we're getting, my last shelter had 240 beds in it. If we get 1 out of every 10 men dropping in to see a counselor each day, that's 24 men who have seen somebody. And we get to know them better, and we're able to refer them on to, some are ready for housing. The whole housing first model, we don't have to fix you before you move into housing. Move you into appropriate housing, then we can work to fix the issues afterwards. But as it is here, we let them out at 7 in the morning. They can head to the day shelter, but our population are not motivated enough to go from one directly to the other and say, can you help me during the day? They're going to do whatever they're going to do for the day. But it's a proven fact, at least through the Salvation Army shelters, that having the on-site counselors there certainly does a lot for people.
Mr. Chester?
Thank you. So just to that point, though, how do we make it happen then? Like, do we need to provide more funding to your shelter, for example, to make it 24-hour, or is it some other change that's required? Thank you.
Mr. Bishop?
We couldn't do it in our shelter. You've been in our shelter, and so we're not physically set up to do it. Not to oversimplify things again, the GNWT is paying for a night shelter, several night shelters. The GNWT is paying for and running some day shelters. Why can't we take all of those funds and somebody runs a 24-hour day shelter at some point in this? It's, again, I make it sound simple, but the funding is already being spent, probably, I'm making a guess, probably $5 million a year or more to house homeless people here in the different agencies. But maybe it can be all under one roof. It does not have to be the Salvation Army running it. It can be a combination of organizations. It can be the GNWT, even though I don't think you want to be in the shelter business, but just a matter of finding the right people to do it with the right funding. The models are out there, and I'm sure all agencies, including the Salvation Army, would gladly share that model with our government here.
Thank you. Mr. Nursu, do you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe, I know there's a warming shelter in Nuvik, and they have a transitional home too for individuals who would like to stay sober. I was in that state a few years ago. I was utilizing the warming shelter for a number of months, and you stated that, you know, people do not want to be at this point, and I believe you because I was there and I was surviving. I didn't want to be there, but I was surviving, and my hometown, my small hometown of Fort McPherson, did not have any facility to to assist me. So everybody goes to the larger regional centers, and I'm just wondering, like, do you see a lot of that? A lot of people from the smaller communities coming to Yellowknife and being housed in your facility?
Mr. Bishop?
That is a very sad but true reality right now. A lot of the people, for whatever reason, when they come to Yellowknife, sometimes people come for medical appointments, and you know, there are those who probably are through the justice system. This is the big city up north, so it has much more here for them, they feel. but it's contributing to the bigger factor that we just don't have appropriate housing and even don't have appropriate sheltering to keep these individuals safe at night. I think a big missing piece in Yellowknife, but not just Yellowknife, I think a big missing piece up here is an actual addiction center. I've always, in my decades doing this, I've always been attached to an addiction center within our sphere of what we do. But here, we're taking individuals who have probably lived here all their lives. This is home for them, and we're sending you down to big city Alberta or BC for 2, 3, 4 months. I can't even begin to imagine what that does to an individual. But then, unfortunately, for the most part, when you're done, you're sent back here, and guess where you end up? They drop you off at one of the shelters again, and the vicious cycle again and again. And a lot of those folks, their original home address are some of the smaller communities and hamlets in Northwest Territories. But now Yellowknife is home for them. A shelter is home for them. And when we run out of shelter beds, sleeping in the tent is home for them.
Mr. Nurse, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I believe that, there's no aftercare for people that do go south for treatment. I've witnessed that for a number of years. They've been sent to institutions down south, and they come back, and within a week they're right back where they started. I also know that I see individuals in Yellowknife that have been put on a plane by the RCMP and just put on the street, and they're still here. I see them, I know them. I've walked around with them in Nuvik, and they're still waiting court cases, and I don't know if they're prohibited from going back to Nuvik, but the RCMP just put them on a plane and that's it. But in regards to treatment, the Gwich'in Tribal Council just announced that they're opening up their wellness camp for 30-day healing programs, and this committee went there in March or sometime in April, and we got a tour of that facility. It's a nice facility, and they also stated that once they're done with their treatment program, that they're looking at building small homes, sort of transitional homes, so that they're not pushed right into society without. But they will be building small homes for them, and right in the middle of the community too. So you know that they're integrated right back into the community slowly and not judged or anything. But they also have a transitional home, which is I feel is fairly successful, because once you come out of the warming shelter and want to straighten your life out, you're put in that sobering home, and they help you with employment, and they help you with obtaining a home in the community. It'll be good if other indigenous governments would be able to, or if the Gwich'in Tribal Council would open that healing center to the whole of the NWT. I don't know how, right now they're saying it's just for the Gwich'in settlement area. So, I believe you would see that very beneficial, because, when I was in Nuvik, I wanted to go back to McPherson, but there was nothing there for me. So, I think with some people from up north, I know they are from the Nuvik region that are here, that wouldn't mind to be closer to home. So would you find it beneficial for other indigenous governments to follow suit and maybe try to get some programs for their regional people? Thank you.
Mr. Brusher?
It breaks my heart to hear what you're saying. I know how true it is. And yes, the short answer is yes. We need more of that. I know those struggling with addictions, more than 90% of the folks that we work with are from the Indigenous population. And what hurts me as much as we would love to be able to have the funding to ensure that we have the appropriate people who understand the Indigenous life here. You know, it's one thing for me to say I'm the stereotypical older white man coming in to see how I can help. But the truth is we need to do better than that. We need to have more of what you just mentioned there. I'm sure you're aware there's a small aftercare place going to open this fall. We're partnered with the NWT on that. It's 5 beds, only just a needle in the haystack to what we need. But we're really hoping that this 3-year project will prove that it's so beneficial to people coming back from down south. Instead of dropping them at the shelter, drop them at this door. We're going to keep you from 30 to 90 days to help you reintegrate back into whatever your definition of a normal life is, whether that's back into your community or if you need to go to a new community, we'll help with that. But that's a small piece of it. I was kind of disappointed it was so small, but I said, you know, we need to take this and prove to those in decision-making roles that this works, and we need more and bigger, and we need them peppered throughout the whole territories. Not everybody wants to spend 90 days recovering in Yellowknife if they're from somewhere 300, 400 kilometers away. We really want to be able to, as long as everybody is in agreement, move them back into their community. That's where the real healing happens, not here in front of a bunch of strangers. So it's a passion. I don't know where to start, but I think, you know, for us the start was this new THARP house, we're calling it. It's a transitional housing for recovery, and we're hoping that this will just take off from here. Not just the Salvation Army doing more of these, the appropriate Indigenous organizations saying, okay, we need them too. The model by then should be ready to go, that people can say, let's just put one here, one there. Because right now, we're bringing you back from Calgary to here, and then when you're ready to go, we might have to then put you on a plane for 400 kilometers away, and there's still that danger when you get there, there's no support.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Morse, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Where do I start? I started out with just a couple questions, and now I've got a whole page of them. But I wanted to just come back to kind of the most fundamental part, and that is, Mr. Testart was asking about it a little bit, and I'm curious. So the 24-hour model that you're using down south, who's typically paying for that? Like, why is that something that's done differently here and in a unique way? Is this, I'm curious to know more about how we got into that situation, and is this a niche that Salvation Army would like to fill if they were adequately funded to do it, or is your feeling that it would be better served by someone else and but it needs to be done either way? I'm curious to understand the difference.
Okay, Mr. Prussia?
I feel how we got there. The Salvation Army shelter here opened in the 90s. I don't think we were recognizing back in the 90s the depth of what homelessness was all about. I think homeless was homeless, and that's where it ended. I think as we mature in this whole area and realize that you know, most of our folks who are homeless, it has to do with trauma, it has to do with mental health, it has to do, the addictions come in afterwards. It's so complicated. I think that's how we got to where we are today. I feel that, I know the last 2 shelters I ran for the Salvation Army are much newer, so we were able to, we already had this knowledge, so we knew what we had to open before we opened it. Would we be interested in something like that here? Absolutely. If the right pieces were in place, we would certainly want to be a part of this, whether we're running it or whether we're one of the partners out there that are feeding back and forth into it. That doesn't matter to me. It's never about, I want to do everything that needs to be done here. It's about figuring out who the best people are to do it, and then how can we partner, whether we're in the building running it or whether we're an outside partner doing what we need to do. But I think it's something that we need to look at here. And again, there are those naysayers out there who will say shelters are not the way to go. I agree, they're not the long-term way to go. But there's a lot of people sitting around a lot of tables right now saying, we don't know what to do with those, depending on who you talk to, the 50 to 100 who are sleeping rough right now in the city. What are we going to do with them? So there's a lot of questions to be answered, but the one question I can answer is, I know what I know from my decades of doing this, but the Salvation Army has a lot of expertise Canada-wide about this and would have no problem working with whoever here in the Northwest Territories to share our knowledge and expertise in it.
Mr. Morris, do you have a follow-up?
I do, thanks. So a number of the things you've said along the way here, you know, that we need a 24-hour shelter, we need an addiction center, there's this aftercare space pilot. I mean, just a comment, this isn't a question, but I mean, the comment you made about having to convince decision makers, I mean, I can tell you that I don't personally need to be convinced that this is a good idea and this is something we should be funding. And I thought that we were relatively clear by setting housing as our top priority that this is something I was very interested in. It seems like we need to do maybe a better job of articulating what we mean by that and ensuring that that is being reflected in budgeting. But to get down to the point, a number of these kind of gaps that you've highlighted, I think maybe, or at least begin to be addressed by the Wellness and Recovery Center that they're planning to build. I just wanted to confirm with you if that is your understanding. I mean, when you're saying to me that you'd be interested in having the conversation, you'd be interested in participating, that seems to be indicating to me that you haven't been part of the conversation about what that facility might be. So where do you see that facility in terms of filling some of these gaps? And if it doesn't, then I'm curious in knowing kind of what further missing pieces need to get addressed, if not there.
Mr. Grisham?
So to answer the question, if we've been involved in anything with the whole wellness center, no, we have not. So I only know the little bit that I hear about it, and I keep hearing about this $24 million wellness center that hopefully will open in the next 2 to 3 years. I asked a very simple question of the NWT one day. So does that encompass the sobering center and everything? It does. That makes sense. How many extra beds are we going to have? We're going to have 9 extra beds. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, 9 extra beds over what they serve now. I still feel a lot of our population, if this is going to be not a very large shelter population, and we're still going to have 2 or 3 other large shelters around here in Yellowknife, I still don't see people being motivated enough to leave my shelter at 7 in the morning and walk over to the wellness center to see what they can do to get well. We need to find a way, if that's the model they're going with, we need to find a way to do that, even if it's holding them by the hand and walking them over there. But the motivation for each of those individuals is they're going to run into their friends along the way and they're going to be sidetracked. Whereby if this wellness center was possibly even a larger shelter area too, now you have them in the building and it's much easier to get them to talk to the people, the professionals that will work in the wellness center. But we know very little about it, except in my 14 months here, I think the opening date has been extended twice already.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Reed, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. And actually, this conversation is poised for a really good inflection point after my colleague's question. And thank you so much for your presentation. One thing that I heard in it was you spoke a little bit about the wraparound supports that are in other Salvation Army locations across Canada. And that really piqued my interest because in my previous life, prior to being an MLA, I worked on the board of the YWCA. their approach is to have these wraparound supports in their transitional housing, and it works really well. I was wondering if you could expand on some of the learnings of those wraparound supports in other locations and what you think may be beneficial here in Yellowknife and again in the territory. I know you touched upon it with Mr. Narasu's comments, but what works in other places and what could we effectively champion here? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Brescia?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the YWCA approach here, and I know they've worked hard to get where they are with that, so that's certainly something that works well here. In my previous appointments, again, I think, you know, one way of doing it is the homeless shelter with the individual professionals working there, and I don't know if targeting is the right word, but every morning we would have a team meeting, and every morning we would identify several of our homeless shelter users whom we feel are ready to take the next step. And these are the folks that we, you know, when they're eating breakfast, we might say, why don't you come up and talk to Julie for a few minutes afterwards before you start your day? And it's shown that it is successful. The relationships are built. It may take a while, but then you kind of get a clearer picture of where this person is in their mental health, their emotional health, if they're going through addictions, and then we can try to get them into housing. Again, back to the housing first model. We'll put you into your housing, and then we're going to build supports around you. Another model that I just actually helped build and in St. John's, Newfoundland, in my last appointment, was through the supportive housing piece. We opened 20 permanent supportive housing units back there. And those units are, you can move in there and you can stay there for the rest of your life. We have 24/7 counselors on site again to help with whatever the needs are. The 20 individuals we put in there are very complex. On average, they lost 6 living arrangements every year for several years before coming in with us. I did check when I was back east 2 weeks ago, 14 of those original 20 that moved in there about a year and a half ago are still there, and they're thriving simply because we have some supports built around it. It might be as simple as making sure somebody takes their meds on time, making sure somebody who has memory issues is eating and showering. Simple things that if left out into a one-bedroom apartment with no supports, you're set up to fail. So there's many different approaches that can be taken. Salvation Army knows some, and I'm sure organizations like the YWCA, they're Canada-wide, they must have some as well.
Ms. Reid, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious if there are ongoing conversations with your organization and other organizations in the shelter network to possibly look at building towards such a model here in Yellowknife. Thank you.
Mr. Brescia?
No conversations yet. Each time we seem to want to open the conversation, we seem to hit a new crisis here in Yellowknife with the homeless folks. So I go back to July, we cut our occupancy in our shelter back to 100% occupancy instead of the as much as 206% we were having because of the levels of violence and that. Now we would like to have had that conversation started again by now, because we have had folks like the housing minister and the premier come to our center and we've talked about it. But the hot topic right now is the encampment, the tent encampment. We've been sitting in meetings about that this week with the GNWT, sitting at those meetings, and I think it was me who had to interject part of the way through, because we were talking about the 17 individuals who will soon be out in the cold once the cold weather hits. And I said, well, what about all those around Frame Lake? What about all those behind Walmart? I said, we're looking at 50 to 100 people. So now that's where everybody's concentration is. How do we get those folks off the street in the next 6 to 8 weeks? That's the conversations that the NGOs are having with the GNWT, with the RCMP and everybody, which means the longer term pieces are again put on the back burner. I will add to it though, that through meetings with our MP, with Michael McLeod, he identified that there's a significant pocket of money available to territorial and provincial governments for housing, and that's everything from the homeless folk to everyone else. So I know that they're working on that right now to see what kind of funding is out there for the longer term fix. But again, those are very, very initial conversations that I think we should have been having before now, but I'm just grateful to see that we're at least starting to have them.
Ms. Reid, do you have a follow-up?
No, thank you. That's great news to hear that those longer term conversations are being considered. And of course, I think everyone in this room is aware of the shorter term considerations that are happening before the snow flies. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we still have time for second set of questions, second round of questions. So Mr. Testart, let's start with Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the subject of the encampments in town, how would you characterize, I mean, we've always had encampments, it's just these ones are very public, but would you characterize that as a failure of the sheltering system? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Brescia?
That does contribute to the failure of our system. There's several things in play with, in particular, this one encampment that's become public in the last few days. We do understand that at least 50% of the folks staying there were recently evicted for living in properties they weren't supposed to be in. Some of those folks have come from down south to come up and live in this property. Now they're living homeless. Yeah, again, the system is a failure. I see why they need to have these encampments, because in speaking with some of these folks who come for our services, they feel like they are safer in an environment where there's multiple of them who, as this one guy said to me, were like-minded. So I guess it's like any of us. We all want to stay with the folks that we feel safe around, and that's what's happening here now. So that does go back to, there's a failure in the homeless shelter system too, because we all know, we all admit that there's been severe violence in those shelters in the past year. We're doing what we can to fix that, but it's going to take a lot before some people will ever come back to trusting living in a shelter again.
Mr. Testart, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what the violence that they're fleeing, I guess, or seeking shelter elsewhere because there's safety concerns, what's driving that? Is this a new feature of sheltering in Yellowknife, or is this something that is kind of historic and this is just a response because every shelter's at capacity, people are on top of each other, or is there something else impacting safety conditions at the shelters? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Brescia?
There's a huge factor driving this. There's always been violence in the shelters, but not to the level we are today. We have a lot of new male shelter users who, again, they have come here from other places and mostly from down south. Some of them come up here and they have some activities in mind that are not very pure. Some of them are drug dealers, and some will actually stay in the shelter because it gets you closer to your customers. They may stay only a night or two, and then they'll move on to their apartments, but they're developing a business plan, for lack of a better term. And we're finding, like, we've interviewed several of our longer term shelter users. We have several people who've been 8 or 9 years staying in our shelter. I noticed one of them, he's with us 9 years. One night, I live next to the shelter, just a couple of doors up, so I noticed him sitting out behind a dumpster at 6:30 one evening. And I called him by name and said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I can't go in there until it's time to go to bed." He said, "Because they're going to take my cigarettes, and if I don't give them my cigarettes, they're going to beat me." And that's sad, because that's, again, nobody should be in shelter for 9 years, but to him, that's what he's calling home. But now that's what he does. And when it gets cold, I said, what are you going to do when it gets cold and it's too cold to be outside? He said, I want to be the first one in the shelter so I can get in the far corner where I got my back to the wall and I can watch what's going on. And that's when we made the decision, okay, we need to do our piece as much as we can to curb some of this violence and some of the abuse of shelter users who are not capable of looking after themselves when these younger 20 and 30 something year olds come up and they're tough. They're tough. They're coming from a lot tougher than what most of our folks have gone through. The drugs that they're bringing with them now, I think we can all admit there's drugs here now that have never been here before. You know, we've always had alcohol problems, we've had marijuana problems and crack problems, but it's getting worse by the day right now. Our CMP don't make public half of what they take out of houses when they make these arrests. But it's so serious now, and a lot of it is coming from these folks driving up from down south with their cars full of whatever it is they're going to sell.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Ms. Morgan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is about staff. You had mentioned that the shelter nonprofits, I think you said they need more qualified staff. Is the problem funding? I know that, you know, you struggle to be able to pay staff at decent wages, and so you would end up getting people who would, you know, be willing to take lower wages, so probably less qualified. Are there other barriers, like barriers to training or professional development? Or I wonder if you can explain what are some of the barriers to being able to get more qualified staff that you need.
Mr. Broussard?
Yeah, funding is a big piece of it for us. You know, we run we run 4 large programs with the GNWT. It's not the place for it, but we're underfunded by $1 million combined for those 4. So we can only pay what we pay for caseworkers. You know, our starting salary for caseworkers is $23 an hour, which gets you nowhere up here. We don't have the funding for that. The other side of it is, if there was more funding out there, it's still going to be a struggle to find the right people for a couple of reasons. We go back to not having all the qualified people we need in the Yellowknife area, people who will relocate from down south to take the jobs. Again, if we bring the salary up to 60 or 70,000 a year, unless just two family members coming making that, they can't even consider coming here. And we actually discourage it when people apply for $60,000 a year jobs, saying, "I'm going to bring my family up. I'm the sole breadwinner for that," because we're setting them up for failure. So it is a housing issue. It is having the appropriately trained people here to do it. And then we compete with the GNWT on every position we have. We always, no matter what position you're working with, any of the NGOs, people are training to move to the GNWT. And I would do the same thing if I was young and I needed to move forward. Our frontline workers, you know, similar jobs within the GNWT can be $20,000 a year difference for the same level. So why wouldn't you move on to that? So all we can do, we have now taken the mantra that we're going to train you the best that we can. So at least when you leave and go to the GNWT, people can say, well, they worked for the Salvation Army. They're good. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes we get a call back from that person a month later saying, next time there's a job opening, I'd like to come back. Because it's not all about the money. But we all know it takes a fair amount of money to live the way we need to live up here. So there's a lot of factors, but again, a lot of it comes back to the whole funding piece. We might have 3 caseworkers throughout our whole 2 buildings that we're funded to pay a little more than the $23 to $25 an hour to, but that's all we have the funding for.
Ms. Morgan, you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bush, you also mentioned, you know, when I've met with you before, concerns around safety for staff. Can you explain some of the challenges facing staff in terms of their safety, which is obviously related to the safety of shelter users, and, you know, steps that you've taken to try to address that, or what more needs to be done, in your opinion? Thanks.
Mr. Broussard?
So back in January, when I was noticing every morning we were having multiple incident reports, and I reached out to our colleagues at the RCMP, and they said, yes, your call ratio has gone way up. We knew we had to do something, so we through the Department of Housing, we got the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness to send a specialist into our building to talk about our shelter. So this gentleman came in and actually moved into the shelter for 2 nights, which surprised me. I came down to the shelter myself. He interacted with my staff. He interacted with all of my shelter users as if he was one of them. So he went away and he said, I'll have a report for you. This report didn't show up for a couple of months, but then when the report came out, the word I keep using was, it was so damning to the Salvation Army and to the NWT, because they ultimately fund this. And I kept calling it, it's a gut punch for me. I knew a lot of these things that he identified were so, but I didn't know to the extent that they were. In his words, in 2 nights, he worked with 10 of my staff in the shelter. He said professionally, he would say all 10 of them are going through PTSD and don't know it. He said there were multiple times throughout the 2 evenings he was there, there was potential for there to be physical danger for the staff. And his last comment to me was, we were putting 55, 60 people in there because it was freezing cold out. His last comment was, the Salvation Army needs to stop thinking with their heart and start using their head. And I took it as an insult at first, and then because the Salvation Army, that's what we do, we think with our hearts. Then I realized, he may be right. So we took all of his recommendations, what we could do internally ourselves, we give them more training, we make sure they're supported in any way we can, we put more security features in, and then we met with the Premier and everybody else and said we are reducing our number down from these close to 60 every night back to 31 beds. That's what we're funded for. We only have 31 sleeping spaces. The other 30 people are sleeping in hallways and in the main foyer and all that. And I have 3 staff looking after 60 people. So I said, that's the issue. So we've done that to reduce the violence in the shelter. The incident reports have gone down 80%. In the 6 weeks we've been doing this, the violence has gone down 70%. The sick time has gone down 50%. Because I know people were calling in sick because they said, I just can't face this again tonight. And we have had 2 staff meetings in the last 6 weeks, and they know me well enough to know now, if there's anything I can do to help my staff, I'm going to do it. And in the last meeting, they said, no, I think you've done all you can at this point. I said, but we need to keep working on this because it's going to continue. But we're certainly doing what we can internally, reducing the beds, obviously increase the number of people sleeping out on the street, but we've done it with the full knowledge of everybody involved, months of advance notice, and every partner out there, including the RCMP, all the Department of Justice, said you're doing the right thing. We need to elevate this somehow. And I think, unbeknownst to us, this whole encampment is helping us, all of us, to elevate it again to those who need to hear that, okay, yeah, we're all working on this behind the scenes, but maybe we need to work a little faster, a little harder.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Morse, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Oh. Thank you. Yeah, I think that you've given us, I really appreciate you coming in and speaking to us, the frankness that you're speaking to us and just kind of bringing us what I'm feeling is very helpful information. I just wanted to kind of give you a thought and have you reflect back to me whether you think we're on the right track or I'm on the right track. I think something that I hear often from people is that the issues we're trying to address when it comes to, homelessness, addictions, they're very complex. It's a very complex thing. It's very difficult to address. I think something that's standing out to me when I hear you speaking about the solutions you'd like to see is that it's not really as complex as I think people are presenting it as being. It's really just offering a continuum of service where people are at. It's very complex in the sense of everybody is experiencing different things. That's complex, but addressing the issues I don't know that it's as complex as it's being made out to be sometimes, and I think that that can cause us to get mired in sort of decision paralysis as to kind of what to do. So I think that in some cases it's being made complex with a suite of piecemeal solutions focused more on implementing individual departmental mandates than offering a well-coordinated continuum of service. And I'd be curious to hear from you, like, what do you think a system will look like that adequately addresses these issues that we're talking about? In very simple terms, what's it going to look like, and are we headed in that direction? Because if we're not, I think we need to take a step back and regroup and figure out how we can get that solution in place, those solutions in place.
Mr. Bishop?
You are correct. It's not as complex as it's made out to be here, because the formula or formulas are already in operation throughout the country here. And nobody is keeping it as a secret. This is my way of doing things, and I'm not going to share it with you. And again, the Salvation Army, we've been doing this for many decades. We've made many, many, many mistakes along the way, and we keep trying to improve it. So we think we have some ways of doing this. So yes, it's complex, but it should not be something that takes, because the word complex is in there, we're going to push it aside, and we're going to, as you said, put piecemeal fixes in there. Do I think we're on the right track, or what do we do to go on the right track here? I keep thinking about this $24 million wellness center. I'd like to know more about it. $24 million in capital money, that's a significant amount of money. Let's not build something that from the moment you build it, it's already too small, or it's already not what we should have had. If we have $24 million, let's let some experts, and I'm not that expert, sit back and say, okay, once we figure out what model may or may not work here, how much is the new building going to cost us now? Maybe it's 34 million or something. You know, we keep talking about there's no money, but if you want to track a homeless person throughout a year, you'd be surprised on how much it costs for this person just to stay alive. Not, $90 a night in a shelter times 365. How many times we call an ambulance, how many times we call the police, how many times they're in the emergency room. That's all money that it costs. So it's extremely expensive already. But I would like to know more about this wellness center, and every time I've brought it up, because I'm nobody in the big picture here, it's like, oh yeah, they've got that under control. Again, it's not mine. It's obviously there are people who are in charge of building that, and it's probably the folks who are running the day shelter and the sobering shelter from the NGO perspective, along with the appropriate departments. But are they looking at the big picture in the right way? Sometimes you don't need to have 5 different locations to fix a person. Fix is not the right word, but to help a person. Maybe we can bring this in a lot closer, and we have one facility in Yellowknife, or we have 2 facilities in Yellowknife. Another question that keeps coming up to mind with this wellness center is, are you taking into account that when you build this and you staff this, again, the vast majority of the folks who are using this are Indigenous. We need to make sure that the Indigenous leadership, the elders, are part of the whole process, right down through it. Not after the fact, oh, we're going to hire some Indigenous counselors or something. We need to make sure that whatever we're building here is appropriate for here. This is different. The whole culture is different here than it would be if we dropped this in Calgary or in St. John's, Newfoundland. And we need to look at it from that lens. And I'm not sure that we are. Maybe we are. What if we are? Again, the Salvation Army knows nothing about it.
Okay, Mr. Morris, do you have a follow-up? You okay? Okay, George. Mr. Nursu?
Thank you, Madam Chair. You stated that you have only 31 beds, and that you reduced the number of intake to cut down on the violence and all that. How do you determine is it first come, first serve, or who comes in?
Mr. Bishop?
Basically, that's what it is. We do a meal for the men at 6:30. Everybody can come for that, whether you're staying at the shelter or not. Typically, we'll serve between 65 and 100 meals a night. And then we close the shelter down for 30 minutes so our cleaners can get in there and clean up from the meal. And now we have reverted to the first 31 individuals who come and register each night, which is, again, not the ideal way to do it, because if I'm the tough guy and I'm number 32 or 33, I'm going to push somebody else out of the way to get in. Thankfully for me, most of my shelter staff have been with us for many years and some decades. They can identify those whom they know are going to cause trouble. And they will say to them right up front, you are impaired. Head over to the sobering center. So we will not allow certain people in, but we will make sure that those whom we know that if we don't let them into the shelter, they're likely going to sleep out back somewhere. We try to get them in there. But it has been tough on my staff who were forcing everybody in to get 50 or 60 people in there to now have to say at some point, stop, we're at 31, we can't go any further. I get it, because we're okay right now, but if we're in February and it's minus 50 and I'm saying let me in, and you're saying no, you can't come in, we're full, that's something that we need to figure out before we get there. And we have given those in authority plenty of notice that we're going to be up against this issue. Months of notice. You know, again, not throwing anybody under the bus. Us cutting back on July the 1st to 31 people. That conversation started in February, and we made it very clear by April to the Premier, the Mayor, the police, July the 1st. We're doing that. So then we still had 2 months to build up to how we're going to do that. And we've always said, we've really only got till that first week in October before we need to figure out what we're doing with all those people, before they end up being out in the minus 20, minus 30 degrees. I have 5 men who sleep behind my building every night right now. I have 2 who continuously go to sleep in the dumpster out back. And it scares me like you would not believe, because our dumpster's picked up 6:30 in the morning. I leave my house every morning before 6:30, and that's the first thing I do when I walk down the laneway. I check to see if anybody's asleep there. I don't know. My fear is that when this big truck picks it up and dumps it in, if somebody's asleep in there, amongst all the clothing, even though they have a little camera inside, will they notice that person that's in there? And if they don't, there's a compactor in that truck. I don't want anybody to, number one, ever face that. I certainly don't want that to be the news story anytime. So that's what we're doing right now. My goal every morning is I come down the road 6:30 before the garbage truck gets there, to make sure that there's not a human in there. And there's been as many as 2 or 3 sleeping in there at a time. Sorry, I went on a tangent then, but.
Mr. Nursu, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, it's more of a statement. In any concern that I bring up in session, I always refer to community-based programs, because the community where I come from know the residents best. You know how they act when they're in trouble. They know how they're when they're sober, and they're helpful. But we seem to be passing these people onto the regional centers, and even out as far as Yellowknife, because I know there's some people that's on the street there that are from my community. And I've always advocated for community-based programs so we can have our people back in our home communities, in our regions, to help them. And right now the Gwich'in Tribal Council is taking the right step, and hopefully take some of these hardships off your organization, and what you're trying to do to help people is a great help to the territory, and I'd just like to thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Brescia? Yes.
I agree with you 100%. One of the comments my staff have been making to me in recent months is around exactly that. Milton said to me one day, he said, there was a time we knew all of our shelter users, and we knew how they were feeling and how you could act around them. He said, but there's so many new people coming here. We don't know them. We don't get a chance to know them. And then what was said to me by another person made a lot of sense too. There's somebody out there in their community that knows them. If they, as you said, if the supports were there in that community and they could stay in their community, over a short period of time, you get to know that person and you get to hopefully be able to guide them down the right track. But we're finding right now, more than 50% of our nightly shelter users are people that none of my staff know, and my staff have been living here, some for all their lives. They don't know them. So that's a disservice to the individual shelter user as well, that they can't get support. All they're getting is, here's your mat, go to sleep, and then get up in the morning and get out. That's what it looks like to them.
Thank you, Mr. Breshad. I do have something to say as well too. And I know that we heard many times from other people as well, other organizations and indigenous government. A lot of other people have said it. Housing policy as it exists failed many of our people. As a result, we have a lot of homeless issues in many of the small communities. So, and I know that there's a lot of people on the housing wait list, and it's like that in Young Life too as well. So we don't see any of the list going down. It just keeps going up, So, and then we heard many times too, and we've said it many times, because many of the people living on the street, they're not just nobody. They are someone's parents, someone's children, someone's siblings, etc. And we know that, we do love and care for our people, and they are loved too as well. And some of the people that in the past that I know that live on the street, some of them were my friends, like they were all our friends, our relatives, Some of them with a high school education, some of them with college education. And so when people say that there is no social class for addiction, that is really true, And I know that there are a lot of families back home or from the regions that are praying for their loved ones, especially living on the street, that they be safe. We know that, and some of them have made an effort to bring them home. They made an effort to bring them home to the small communities, but it's sad to say, but some of them, they return. They go back to the larger regional center because there's more resources. There's more things for them to do to deal with their issues, which is lacking in many of the small communities. And you've said it too quite a few times, and Mr. Nursu have said it too quite a few times. So, and even in your report, I know that, housing as a human right, we have to fix the housing policy as it exists to make it, to make it better for our people, so that we don't have to, hopefully, to eliminate homelessness. So we don't have to be dealing with this within the next 20 years or something like that. So, and even in your report, you said everyone just wants, needs, and deserve a dignified place to rest their head at night and call it home. And it's all about money. So I just want to know if you reach out to other organizations or to partner with them to build a tiny home to eliminate homeless. Thank you. Mr. Breshad.
Thank you for that question. In a meeting we were at earlier this week, we were made to realize that there is some funding immediately available. So I do know that as NGOs, some of us will be getting together to discuss how we can best use that money for something short term. Even at that table this week, somebody said, well, what about all these camp trailers that are not being used down in Alberta? They sleep 20 people at a time. So there were people making notes on that. Maybe that's a good start. Tiny homes is certainly something that is catching on in some areas across the country. Don't see why it can't work here. Certainly it's a lot cheaper than trying to build, traditional homes for everyone. We are, as NGOs, we do meet with each other quite consistently, whether it's one-on-one or in groups. And I know we've got a couple of meetings coming up now to discuss the emergency homeless piece on our own, aside from the government officials, to see what we can do from our perspective and what we're going to ask from them. And I do believe from this meeting this week now that we will have more serious conversations. Once we figure out what to do with this group of 50 plus people out there, I think then we need to take a step back and say, okay, what are we going to do once we get past the winter? Now that we've got them all in a warm place for the winter, what are we going to do long term? Because wherever we put these people for the next 8 months before winter is over again, it's going to be temporary. If I have to find a space in my center, I don't know where it is, but I have to find a space. That means it's not going to be the ideal space, but we will find something and we will offer it up to the GNWT to see if it's suitable. But that just goes to the bigger conversation that this is not the way to do this every year. You can't be going back to the NGOs and saying, can you find 50 beds again for me for 8 months? And in May, we're going to kick you back out into the tents again until September or October. We need to find a way that if somebody is sleeping in a tent, it's by their choice because they don't want to go to where there's a bed available to them. But we're not there. Not at all. We're full every night. The sobering center is full every night, and the Women's Society is full every night. So it's not like we're hoarding beds that people could sleep in.
Thank you, Mr. Brichette. You know, like I said, some of these homeless are people living on the street. They have high school education, and some of them have trades. So I think, and I know there was a recent articles on, just recently that people were trying to take it take it upon themselves to help the people living on the street, with that tent. So with a stick built, I'm sure we can use some of these people with the skills that they have. Do you think it would be more cheaper to build or to bring the trailers, vacant trailers, small trailers from the south, or to build it right here, than using all the resources that we have in the north? Thank you.
I think it will be cheaper to bring the trailers up, but I don't know if that will be the best long-term solution. Again, these trailers typically sleep 20 individuals, so you are back almost into a shelter type situation again. If there was a way to afford and have the capability to build these tiny homes, these small homes, and put people in them who could have pride in owning their home, even if it is only 120 square feet. It's their space. Go back to the dignity piece of it. I have a place to lay my head. I feel safe because I can close and lock my door at night. That's the piece that's missing now. So certainly one way would be cheaper, but I do believe the other way of giving everybody a space would be much more beneficial in the long term, not just financially, but for their own mental well-being and the well-being of our community who are suffering as well, because many of our community folks are looking at the homeless population through one lens, and it's not a very nice lens. And for those of us who work in the homelessness area, as you said, they're somebody's mother, they're somebody's father, somebody's child. It's a sad reality. My father lived and died in a Salvation Army shelter, so I know that part of it. I was 23 when he died. Running a homeless shelter back in my hometown was my dream job. My second day there, one of my best friends, whom we hadn't seen for years, came in looking for a bed. It just broke me to know, back to your point, it could happen to anyone. It really does. This was an educated man who was in his 50s at that point, who had worked hard all his life. And my first question to him was, because I knew him personally, is what the heck happened? But it just brings the reality back to me every day when I see somebody that I know or knew from a previous life, and here they are now. And we can all be better than we are today. I have hired people from my homeless shelter when they've got level to work in the facility. One of the best counselors in Ottawa spent 14 years in a homeless shelter. Now he's a homeless shelter counselor. One of the best ones in Ottawa, only because somebody was able to take him and walk him through a system that was appropriate for him.
Thank you, Mr. Brichette, for the presentation. So this concludes the public briefing of our on housing as a human right. Thank you for coming. Mhm.